Welcome back. We are live here in the Situation Room with Balaji Srinivasan and Taylor Lorenz, which might be their first time ever meeting.
I think so.
Is this wow? Certainly first time ever appearing on a podcast together. We're
Live stream.
live
Live
streaming.
stream.
Yes.
That's right.
Yeah, we're really grateful to have you here. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Good to be here. Should we get started? Can I ask some questions? Good.
Go for it.
All right. All right. So first, just Taylor, clear the air. I have no issues with you. I wish you the best in life. I'm happy you've become an independent creator and so on and so forth. Looks like you're living your best life. Do you have any issues with me? Are we good?
I don't think so. Thank you for saying that, Balaji. I think you had a different tune, but that's okay. I know how the internet goes. But yeah, excited to have a conversation and chat.
So I have a few questions for you. So first, individuals versus institutions. This is actually something I think that we both thought a lot about. There's been a trend of really prominent creators like, let's call them writers, Nate Silver, Glenn Greenwald, yourself, Iglesias, Jesse Singal, Barry Weiss, Tucker Carlson, from across the political spectrum that have now gone and done their own Substacks, their own podcasts. You're right in the middle of that. How do you see that? What do you think catalyzed that? Do you think that's going to continue?
Yeah, I wrote a book that's somewhere behind me, falling on the bookshelf back there, called Extremely Online, that actually charts the rise of the content creator industry, which I'm sure you know as well. But for people that don't, I think a lot of people, especially when COVID hit and everybody was pushed online in 2020, started to realize that the internet had sort of effectively become the default real world. Like, we're all getting more online than ever. The internet is shaping the sort of offline world increasingly. And especially people in Silicon Valley, even though they had invested in sort of these platforms, I think that's when they started to really recognize the influencer world, for lack of a better word, the content creator industry, distributed media, new media, whatever you want to call it. You saw them funding, they invented the term the creator economy, and they sort of started to fund it. And so I think a lot of people in tech started to really recognize this shift in media that had been happening for quite a while. As I write in my book, this shift, and people that follow a lot of these platforms obviously know, is not something that just happened in 2020 or happened even recently with social media. I started as a blogger. So I actually was writing on blogs, right? And that's how I got popular. You mentioned Nate Silver, Matt Iglesias. I think a lot of us millennials, that was sort of the TikTok of our day, right? Was where you could go. So I started independent as a blogger, and the blogger ecosystem was very robust in the 2010s, even prior to sort of social media as we think of now. So I think this trend of media becoming more digital and more distributed that's been happening for 30 years and will continue. And I think it gets press cycles, come and go. But I think that it's sort of a broader trend than just anything that's happened in the past couple of years. What's happened now is that it's easier for independent creators to monetize. Whereas back when I was a blogger, it was you could put some display ads on, but there weren't sort of brand deals in place in the same way that there are now.
I think that's right. I think that's why you're right that creator economy was kind of a neologism and so maybe a late adopting thing. But I think the economy part is, as you correctly point out, the novel part, the fact that Substack rose and people can make careers, actually quite good money on Substack.
But Patreon, I would say Patreon paved the way for that.
Okay,
yeah, because Patreon launched in 2013 and really developed that direct subscriber sort of relationship. It's just that Patreon was primarily doing that for video, and Substack was doing it for writing. Of course, now all of them and Beehive are doing everything. Now they have podcasts, video, everything. But I do think that Patreon pioneered the subscription.
I guess that's perhaps because there was more of a tradition of sort of independent film, and people started with independent film first, and then it came to independent journalism. Do you think that's what happened?
No, I would say it was content creators. It was YouTubers, right? It was these independent people that were out there producing, incredible content, whether that was on was on YouTube and then Instagram as well, short form video. We saw the rise of all of those live streaming apps in the mid 2010s as well. We're in another live streaming boom, but 15 years ago, there was a previous live streaming, 10 years ago, around 2015. So I think that these models have been taking place for a while. It's just that I think that the mainstream media and the tech industry and sort of more elite circles, you're starting to see it sort of bleed up to that. Whereas they used to when I started as a blogger, there were a lot of conversations and sort of machinations of like, are bloggers actually journalists, right? And I
Right.
think there was this, this elitist view of people that made content on the internet or people that did reporting for the internet. And now I think that's basically gone away, where it's not seen as something different, at least not by anybody that has more than two
I
brain
think that's
cells.
right. And I think that's right. And actually, I think there's a dimension to that where there's a period where, quote, the blogger was below the journalist. But now the online creator has an audience that's often orders of magnitude larger than, a traditional journalist. So the internet has kind of ascended to being the primary where the culture is
Well, some of those
created, right?
bloggers were doing journalism too, right? That's why we all ended
Right.
up in mainstream media. I think like a lot of them were doing amazing journalism. I mean, look at the way that bloggers were sort of covering the Iraq War and punching holes in U.S. narratives. The reason that we know about all the waterboarding stuff was that amazing, I can't remember her name, blogger that sort of went through all these transcripts. So I think that was happening. I think that a lot of legacy institutions, as I've written about in my book and throughout my career, have really struggled to adapt to that shift because they do want that top-down broadcast model of media. Unfortunately, I do think we have this new sort of ecosystem of gatekeepers, for lack of a better word, and that is the tech platforms themselves.
Yeah, I actually agree with that. That's why decentralization and cryptocurrency and blockchain and so on and so forth.
I know you're big on that stuff.
I am big on that. That's right. But part of the reason I'm big on that is for internet freedom, because otherwise PayPal can freeze your funds, seize your funds. But
Absolutely agree.
Right?
Yeah,
And,
I mean, yes, I cover that
ahead.
stuff all the time. I totally agree with you. I think it's horrifying.
There's something else actually, which is an interesting area of potential intersection. You've written, I think, about age verification laws and so on and so forth. And often they have good intent. But they're the, like the wedge, thin edge of the wedge of just, basically de-anonymizing the internet and not allowing people to kind of read, and, Russia and especially China are far down that spectrum in terms of a controlled top-down internet. I think in that part of the world, let's say the state has really won over the network. And here, I do kind of think the network may be stronger, like here being actually the Anglo-speaking world. Do you disagree with that?
Oh my God, Balaji,
Okay.
no, I totally disagree with that. Look at what's happening. We've got
Sure.
what is it, 25 states right now with age verification laws in the books, identity verification, as you said. The Democrats are making this a primary topic that they are pushing, mass surveillance.
Yes.
And we have the Kids Online Safety Act, COPPA 2.0, the Kids Act with that broader group that, of laws that includes COSA that went through in the House, made it out of committee. I disagree. I think there's this, I just covered the social media addiction trial. I don't know. I do think that we're in the midst of this crisis right now where there's almost no one fighting for internet freedoms. We have Fight for the Future, the EFF, a few civil rights groups, a few human rights groups, but overwhelmingly, I don't see a lot of support from the public, unfortunately, and I hope this changes, to fight these horribly dangerous laws that will destroy the internet. I mean, your correlation with China and Russia is correct. That is a version of the internet I think we should fight against. But unfortunately, I don't know. I don't see that happening right now.
So the thing is, I'm seeing a bunch of tech coming up, and I'm seeing political. So again, this will be red, blue coded, but hopefully I can just speak about this impartially or what have you.
We're not talking about politics. I think
Yes,
this is an issue that should be like, and no matter where you are in the political spectrum, you should not want to have to enter your biometric data and upload your driver's license to read a Wikipedia article. That's crazy.
Completely agree. I think there is a pro-freedom movement in some ways, internet freedom. So to be clear, there's all kinds of crypto scams and speculation stuff that rise in crypto, but there's latent potential there. And some of it realized for true internet freedom because it's a way of funding things in a decentralized way. It's a way of operating things outside of platforms. It's open source programmable. And there's like new VPNs, for example, like Obscura is like a new VPN for like busting through the Great Firewall. There's Starlink. And I think, in general, space-based internet access is going to become a bigger thing where, even states can't clip the undersea cables. And I think that many states are going to have the second move is going to be that if you filter and control the internet too much, it actually harms your economy. And so then states will have to kind of come back. And maybe you disagree with that. Go ahead.
I don't know. These platforms don't require free speech to make a profit. We know, look at Meta, look at Google. These companies will happily trade away our free speech rights, to have a more friendly regulatory environment, to be more appear more friendly to advertisers. Like, I just don't trust them to protect our rights at all. I hear you on all the crypto stuff, and I talk to people in the crypto world, and they like tell me all, oh, it's going to be fine. We're going to get decentralized. And
Well,
I don't know. I just don't see that happening on like a mass adoption scale yet, at least anytime soon.
so let me give a few more. So first of all, I agree with you that bad forces are converging. However, there's another piece of the puzzle now, which is we can actually use AI, Claude Cowork, and things like that to actually rapidly clone interfaces of existing scaled apps and then just swap out the back.
And then Meta comes after you, abusing the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act to get your app shut down, or you can't get on the App Store or whatever.
Maybe. The App Store, I agree, by the way. The App Store and the Android and the Google Play Store are bottlenecks. But there's sort of being a degree of return to desktop. And then the question is whether they're going to be doing packet filtering at the router level and so on and so forth. And then you've got Starlink. I think that, there's a tension between what I call cloud and land, where to have global markets, to have a following that's very large globally, you kind of want the open internet. But then all these states and all these groups want to have a closed internet. So I think that there is a tension between those two things. And I think it's going to play out differently. One thing I will say is the open web is also under attack right now because, if you notice, like Google Incognito, like it'll always prompt you for some CAPTCHA nowadays. You may have noticed that, right? And that's because people keep, hitting the open web and, let's say downloading data for training AI models. So lots of the open web, GitHub, for example, is down a lot because of this. So a lot of things are going to have micropayments.
Also, the Internet Archive. We might lose the Internet Archive because, of the same sort of nonsense.
So this is actually an interesting area where I think we're both. I'm sure we'll have many differences, but internet freedom is definitely an area I think that we.
So you should.
we agree on.
You have billions of millions of dollars. You should fight these laws. You should put money to destroy these identity verification laws. There's so much money on the other side. There's so much money, and then you have these cynical companies like Meta that will, on one hand, sort of fight, their certain laws that benefit them, but then now they're advocating for the App Store Accountability Act, which would remove the complete anonymity from the internet. So we can't trust these companies. So I'm not the millionaire in the room, so I think you should back some of these groups fighting
absolutely.
those laws.
In fact, actually, I do fund a lot of stuff like this, like a lot of VPN encryption type stuff. I think so. Some of that, for example, we just did Zcash recently, which is truly encrypted private capital. It's like basically Bitcoin, but with zero knowledge. Zero knowledge in particular, is that an area you're following at all?
Yeah, a little bit, because people are saying like, oh, we'll use zero knowledge to do the identity verification stuff. And,
yes. Yeah. So there's actually a proposal there. If you're talking about, like, Coinbase put a proposal to do zKYC. So let's say the state has some, let's just give the benefit of the doubt and say they have a legitimate interest in making sure that there's not a North Korean passport or something like that, fine. Then that you're not on some terrorist blacklist, whatever. You can actually prove just that and only that without giving up anything else. Yeah. And I actually think there will be an economic incentive for this stuff because we're going to need to do a lot more proof of human to log onto sites, but we also want to give up all this information because of all the hacks and so on. So that's an important direction that we are funding now. But a lot of these things, what happens is you fund them and they're like seeds and they sprout 3, 5, 8, 10 years later, Yeah. But some of the regulations are happening now.
I just think that we need people to really wake up and rally. I mean, ironically, persona, and I will give Rick some credit because he really engaged. The CEO really engages. I completely disagree with the concept of his company or the fact that it's needed, but they have a great tracker that they made for, tracking some of these state level laws and federal laws around. And I think it tracks globally of this sort of effort to age verify the web.
Like the UK thing.
Yeah, we're seeing it in the UK. We're seeing it here. I don't know why there's not more of a coalition fighting against these laws. To me, this is again, something that shouldn't be a left or the right issue. The far right religious fundamentalists have always wanted to censor the internet, right? That's they've been trying to do that since the Communications Decency Act. But now we see these like liberal, like ostensibly liberal groups getting on board with it, and Democrats leading the effort. You see Gavin Newsom talking about, wanting to ban social media for under 16s, like all this, like Keir Starmer. I think it's so incredibly dangerous. It's an affront to everything that the internet stands for. And I just think that people need to wake up and stop feeding this moral panic about sort of kids and the internet and
So
fight these laws.
how do you convince sort of ordinary parents? Like you have people who are just constantly surrounded by this like pedo panic on the internet. Like if you let your kids go on social media, they're going to be totally brain rotted. They're going to be groomed. And sometimes this does happen. So how do you convince like ordinary parents that no, like it isn't that good for kids to be on the internet in some ways?
It's very,
yeah. Go ahead.
What were you going to say, Balaji?
Yeah, I was going to say, I do think parents should probably keep their kids off the uncensored, unfiltered internet for a long time. But that is a little different than whether, the thing is, Democrats will justify almost anything on the basis of safety and Republicans on the basis of security.
Well, the Republicans are also exactly on security. Yes, correct.
On security, exactly, right? So safety versus security. There's actually a famous old cartoon, which is how do you want this wrapped? And it's like controlled
I love
internet
that cartoon.
speech. You know the one I'm talking about?
So good. Yes, Mike Masnick posted it. I love it.
Great. So maybe you can put that on screen, right? And so like the Democrat version is like protect kids and the Republican version is like national security or something like that. And the thing is, those are not necessarily always false. It's just that the way that they have tended to be interpreted in the Anglo world. Yeah, I think that might be it, right? Maybe
yeah, we got it. We got it on stream. Can we put it up?
Yeah. When did that come out? That was like 20 years ago, 30 years ago.
Well, this is the whole concept of the Communications Decency Act to begin with, right? This is how we thankfully have Section 230 still, although they want to dismantle that. But
yes. And I think one thing that is, I believe, going to be on the other side of this, what does a coalition for the free internet look like? It is essentially, it has to in some part be those people who make capital from a free internet as opposed to a closed internet. And again, it's really, you're right that we should be more public about talking about some of these things. There's a bunch of things that I've funded that my colleagues have funded with me and separately that actually are for this stuff, and we can put that out there. I mean, there's a whole freedom stack, right? It's not just cryptocurrency and private currency. It's VPNs. It is anti-surveillance technology, for example. There's something I'm looking at where you can block it when someone's recording you, right? Like it's like you put down a device and then that microphone just gets white noise and it blocks the recording. There's a whole stack of this type of stuff which protects your freedom, privacy, and so on in the digital era. We should talk about that more.
I think that's amazing. And I love those products and I support all the entrepreneurs that are building these types of things. Yes, that's the great cartoon I think that was put up. But yeah, I mean, I support that. I just think that we need people to be a little bit more vocal too. I think that these tech companies have really played both sides of the issue. Chris Best from Substack, to be fair, has like spoken up about it, but they still are complying with it. Blue Sky spoke up and sort of didn't want to, or were trying to not comply, but then ultimately did comply. Pornhub has pulled out of certain states. I just think it's really hard because because we need a stronger coalition. And I think we need more tech people to get involved and talk about the fact that like, this is bad for business. This is bad. I mean, I was talking to somebody even just who runs like a mesh networking or a messaging app that people use for protests and stuff. And he's like, how am I supposed to do, age verification? Or these Linux developers, right, that have gotten very mobilized on this issue that are like, what do you mean operating? Like, do you even know how this works? Like so many people writing these laws, like they don't have a basic understanding of technology. So yeah. And that doesn't mean that you should give your kid unfiltered internet access to no one is saying that. What we're saying is you actually have enterprise level surveillance tools to use on your children. Currently, there are consumer tools. If you want to, if that's the mode of parenting that you want to go and you want to restrict them from the internet, you have the tools to do that now. But we do not want the government to come in and remove all anonymity from the internet so that Johnny doesn't see the wrong video when he's 15.
Well, the thing is also the justification for it is always going to be child safety or national security,
which doesn't even.
But then it'll be extended. It'll be extended to much more than that, right? And so that's, I think, the civil libertarian, angle on this. It's funny. I think that the coalition for this is probably going to be, as you mentioned, Linux, more on the crypto and open source side than the Web 2 side. And the reason is Web 2, like the entire 2000s was about like you had the initial open web of everything was a client and server, and then Web 2 was the only way you could scale was you had a centralized database in a hub and you could serve ads against that. And so the whole thing is about how do you decentralize the back end. And it's funny, all of that now finally works. You can now blast transactions on chain, and you're seeing that with stable coins and other kinds of things. But it's one of those things where I can point to it, and then one day there'll be like an explosive product that actually arises out of that. You will see it. But I think you're right that we should accelerate on that. So
I
actually,
just think
I want to ask
one other thing, like, please, like, get it, like, if to anyone watching, like, we have to kill these laws. Like, if these laws go through, they just set this horrible legal precedent that is so anti-innovation, that is so anti-freedom. Like, we don't want to give the government power over online speech, over online content. Now they're trying this ridiculous sort of way to try to circumvent Section 230 around like addictive design. Like, oh my God, you made the product too good. People are now listening to 9 hours of music on Spotify. They're addicted to music. We need to, this is a ridiculous concept. So I just think like we really need to, I want people in the tech industry to be a bit more vocal about it, and don't be, they'll be like, oh, you're defending, what, you don't want children to be safe. That's a ridiculous premise, and we should reject those premises.
So the thing about it is, I think in between, let's call it American anarchy and Chinese control, where there's like an American style of just total freedom for everything and the Chinese top-down style, I think there is like an internet intermediate where people can opt into constraints. And the issue here is that that's like a bunch of different subcultures, but the exact constraints are being chosen from them by a top-down system. They don't actually necessarily align with what they want. You might see a lot of digital tribes where there's a free internet within that tribe, and then it's untrusted internet outside it.
Which is bad. I want us to like, because then like that keeps kids less safe too. It's like, then they're just going to the unfiltered, and like this, I just want like a free and open internet for everyone. And I don't want like some mom in Missouri to have to learn how to use like crypto technology or whatever to freely express herself online,
It's interesting because those states that can't regulate the internet may not make it. And we'll see what happens on this, but because if they can't control the flow of capital and speech in their borders, let me give another kind of thing, which is actually another angle that you didn't bring up, but that a lot of folks on the right think about, is scripting drones, on territory, right? Like what Ukraine did in Russia, right? They can remotely control a drone. And as humanoid robots get better, more than 10 years ago, there's a company called Double Robotics. I don't know if you've ever heard of them, like Telepresence. So you can, with an iPad. Yeah, so I would attend meetings at A16Z with and it's actually pretty cool. Even 10 years ago, this stuff existed. And even back then I gave a talk which said that your immigration policy becomes your firewall. Because if you can animate, like, let's say you put on a VR headset and you're not controlling, you can control a drone, but now you're controlling a humanoid robot and it's animating around, right? Just the ability to send packets around the world means you can literally be there physically and kind of walk around and do things. So that kind of challenges our notion of what border control is. And China has actually put out a whole set of statements. For 20 years, they've said their control of digital packets across the border is on par with their control of physical packets against the border. And they've always framed it as a security issue. And now that's actually becoming something that's harder to ignore, because it is true that if anybody can send a packet to anybody, you can control a robot and so on and so forth. Of course, it also means you can do telesurgery and you can do all kinds of great stuff. You can monitor your factories remotely. There's a lot of obviously good stuff beyond just the extreme edge case of, some terrorists using a drone. But I do think we're going to renegotiate digital borders, so to speak, like what is allowed, what is disallowed. Anyway, okay, so good topic, something to think about, and I may have put out a set of things on what we're funding. I have a kind of another question for you. Something here's a funny way. Let me use some 2020 speech. The New York Times owned by a guy, Arthur Sulzberger. He's son of his father's 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 father.
Yeah.
And you as a woman and me as a person of color could never be the publisher of the New York Times, right? We actually had to go independent to the internet.
Never
right?
say never. I don't want to be the publisher of the New York Times. I don't think you want that either, Balaji.
I don't want that either. But basically, actually, I would argue until really maybe the 2010s, 2020s, there really wasn't freedom of speech, because you didn't, freedom of the press belongs to those who own one, right? Like, never argue with the man who buys ink by the barrel, right? There was radio licenses and TV licenses and newspaper licenses. So in a sense, we're actually in, if you zoom out, arguably the golden age of the free internet and free speech and so on and so forth.
I
in
think
some
that
sense.
I think that the 2000s honestly were the most free with blogging. But I think maybe you got a little bit more freedom in the 2010s because of distribution and the ability to reach people at scale through social media. But I think we're in a regression. I mean, I agree with Jacob. I'm going to mispronounce his last name, Mashima. I'm a huge fan, but he wrote about, sort of like we're experiencing this global free speech recession. And I do think that, again, because we are seeing this escalation of internet censorship, mass surveillance. I think that there is no one. I mean, I was told by speaking to an activist recently about kind of, again, fighting these identity verification laws, child safety sort of. I put that in quotes because they're not real child safety laws. They're identity verification laws. And she said, don't even say free speech. Like it's not an issue that young people support these days. And I think we see that through the polling where young people do not support free speech. So I think this is a civil liberty people are willing to trade off. I think that a lot of it is, I think that the techlash has fed a lot of it. I think this moral panic over sort of misinformation. I think that it's just a value that increasingly is seen as like dangerous, right? People, this idea of dangerous speech and misinformation. And I think a lot of people that have, I don't know, honestly. I think there's probably a lot of other socioeconomic factors. I don't know, honestly. There's probably scholars that have thought
I can give one thesis or kind of a contributing thing. If you look at the graph of Google and Facebook ad revenue, it goes up to the right, and like print media revenue goes down like this. And there's a similar graph for like Chinese manufacturing, it goes up to the right, and like the US share of global manufacturing. So in a sense, to very roughly say, like the internet disrupted, let's say, blue America, and China disrupted red America. And so that means many people in both blue and red America are very negative on both China and the internet. And because they look at their lives are getting worse as Asia and China and the internet rising and getting better. So that is, in my view, driving a lot of nostalgia.
And a lot of pro-China sentiment as well, where like there's a lot of people that are like, and by the way, there's a lot to like about China. They have a lot of good things in China. What we should not seek to replicate is the infrastructure of their internet, which is so heavy on surveillance and very dystopian, I would argue, sort of version of that.
I think this is a big and complicated topic. I think China is very competent, but I also think China's a lot like Apple, where you can't run the software without the hardware, or vice versa. And so they would even say themselves, like, it's, their system isn't meant to be exported and so on and so forth. So I think trying to do China outside China, it might work in like Vietnam or places like that. They're very culturally similar and close, but I think they're going to try it in places like Canada. Maybe, Newsom is close to Xi and so on and so forth.
What do you mean by do China? Like what policies?
Well, so for example, actually MAGA is trying to do China outside China. Example, tariffs, right? Example, to focus on reindustrialization. Even the obsession over Taiwan is basically, arguably this is a whole thing. The last 10 years can be seen as both blue and red America trying to clone China, where Republicans rejected free trade to go for tariffs and Democrats rejected free speech. There's an Atlantic article that said China's right about speech
Republicans
controls.
also reject free speech, though. Let's be clear that that is something that both of them don't.
That's right. And Biden was also, he had his own Build Back Better, reindustrialization campaign. It's a bipartisan thing. I'm just saying, in terms of where the
vibes.
There's been an aspect of implicit China envy on both sides. Even, for example, copying COVID lockdowns was copying, China did that first, and then the US went second. And in many ways, the issue is that if you're copying something without admitting you're copying it, then it's going to be very bad. It's like saying, I'm going to copy Google, let me set up a website. Well, obviously there's a lot of depth to it that you have to study, to do that. And so trying to do China outside China, another example of that is many countries actually buy weapons from both America and China, but the American weapons are pointed out. They're like pointy missiles, but the Chinese stuff is pointed inward. It is the security state and the monitoring and so on and so forth. And I do think that, with Carney's deal with China, that's a huge deal if you saw that. In a sense, here's a funny line. Okay, I know some political both say, like, Carney is maybe the most important American liberal, and Nayib Bukele is the most important American conservative, even though Carney's a Canadian and Bukele's a Latin American. And there are different models, but basically Carney is very much the first that really went into the Chinese camp, and I think you're going to see others follow. And there are many things that are, like, you have to just respect China's execution in terms of being number one in steel and number one in cars and all that type of stuff. But I don't think you can copy China outside China. People will try, but I don't think it'll actually work. And
I don't
I
think
think
we
it'll
should
actually be
try.
bad.
Yeah, I think it's best. It's going to be
No,
bad.
yeah, exactly. That's what I say. Like, I think sorry, I should be clear. I think that people will try, but I think that will be bad when people do try. Because they're going to copy like some surface level piece without copying. I mean, China went through 100 years of churn, and it's not just communism, it's Confucianism, it's legalism, it's like all of these different traditions that are merged together, and they have the rule and the exception to the rule and the exception to the rule, and so on and so forth. So one thing for young creators, one thing that's funny is I never thought, I'm in a sense a technologist that became a creator, and you are a creator who's at least, I mean, you've always been interested in tech, but you're more focused on that perhaps now than you were in the past. Maybe I'm wrong about that.
I love techno. I got into this because I love technology.
Great. So what's your, for people who are just starting out, should they join the New York Times or should they go independent?
People ask me this all the time. I think it depends on kind of who you are and what you ultimately want to do. When you're young, I think absolutely do not join a legacy media organization. That would be insane. Do not do that if you're under the age of 35. Honestly, because you want to get skill, you want to develop skills, and you're not going to develop skills, especially digital skills, at a legacy media organization that's like sort of slowly atrophying. But at the same time, I'm glad that I did time, and I still freelance for legacy media. Like, I'm glad that I learned a lot. I was so critical. Balaji, I know how critical you are of the New York Times. When I started out, when I was a blogger, that's like what got me into blogging, was reading the mainstream media, their delusional coverage of tech, the condescending way that they talked about independent media. And I thought, I'm going to write my own articles. I'm going to become a blogger. I can publish my own stuff, and then I think working in those newsrooms made me realize there is a lot to learn. There's a lot of really amazing benefits that comes with working at those places.
Talk about that
but
for a
you're
second.
Not gonna.
How does that work? Like, what is the culture like? How does a story arise? How did the editors get involved? How does that work?
Yeah, I mean, I can only speak to sort of like the tech team and working on sort of tech, and I was on the style section briefly too. But it's a lot of journalists that genuinely care about their beats, genuinely want to write about things, and kind of sometimes they pitch stories, sometimes other people, sometimes they get a story, sometimes they pitch a story, whatever. You go out, you report the story, you do interviews, you write it up, it gets published and edited. It's pretty straightforward. Now, I think each desk is different, each reporter is different, each editor is different, right? So there's a lot of dynamics. I have a lot of problems with legacy media and the editorial output that they kind of often engage in. But overall, I think the reporters there are not the problem. I think management at some of these legacy media places can be not great, but and I mean not great in the sense that, like, I mean, I loved my editor. Tech editor at the New York Times is brilliant. But and I'm sorry, I know that's going to trigger some people to say, but she really is. But I think that management at some legacy media organizations sometimes they don't always understand the business models, the changing nature of media, and they can make dumb decisions by sort of mismanaging legacy media. But I think there's a lot to learn from a legacy media. I think that people there generally try to find the truth and generally try to adhere to journalistic standards, which is not something that everybody in the creator industry does.
So post 2021, one thing that we observed in tech is there had been a lot of, kind of Twitter fights between, journalists and technologists pre 2021. But then after that, it seemed to actually drop off a fair bit. Do you have any, was there like a directive? It said like, hey, don't get in fights on X or something?
I think Andy Stone he's a little bit less online now, out there fighting with journalists. I mean, I wouldn't call him a technologist, but I think that like a lot of
the Facebook guy.
Yeah, I think a lot of the ways
true.
that these companies engage directly with journalists was online. Like a journalist, I mean, there was this idea, I think it was more sort of, I can't remember if it started really pre-2020, but certainly like once the techlash sort of started and you had this much more sort of antagonistic relationship between media and tech, like you saw a lot of tech companies sort of take to the internet and try to, quote tweet reporters and say that's not true, or, sort of like have these conversations in public, which I actually think is a benefit. Like that's good. I want to see those conversations happen publicly. I think it's good that, they're happening. But because I think sometimes there are things that maybe don't make it in a story that a company or a founder might feel like they really want included or they want out there. So I like that founders now have a voice online, because I think it holds journalists accountable. I always say that like the fact that I write about people I write about influencers primarily, and like the fact that they have a massive megaphone and can respond to me, I think makes me a better reporter. It makes me sure that like when I'm going to come with a story, it's correct, and they can't, whatever they can't do, they can't sort of say, you know what I mean? It's like there's more accountability that way. But I don't know. I wouldn't say it was like post 2021 thing. I think everyone was just so online in 2020. Um, I mean, so everybody was sort of like fighting, but I don't think it was like a top down
Interesting.
thing.
Well,
I think also the platforms changed too. Like, you had Elon take over Twitter. You saw the fracturing of Twitter. TikTok is where a lot more cultural conversation happens now.
well, right. So exactly right. So the fracturing is a big thing. I was going to ask you next, because now
Podcasts.
we've gone from X or Twitter to, actually Twitter's dead. So there's X. There's Blue Sky, there's Truth, there's Substack, there's TikTok, and
Threads, Mastodon.
Most of these seem like they don't have much real discourse on them, though.
Oh God, go on Blue Sky, Theo. There's discourse you couldn't even imagine on there.
Maybe Blue
Same
Sky,
with
Truth
Threads.
Social.
I
Truth
think
Social, I'm not
TikTok
so
is
sure.
real. TikTok is real.
TikTok
real.
is where, I mean, I think
Yeah.
there's discourse. Is it productive discourse? No, I'd argue the discourse on Threads and Blue Sky is insular and unproductive. I think TikTok is where cultural conversation happens now in a way that it doesn't happen. I think X is the nexus for like tech and politics, but I think pop culture has moved to TikTok and YouTube to a lesser extent.
Yes. So it's interesting because the thing is, do you think, I mean, in some ways, I think 4chan and TikTok have sort of taken over, where, 4chan used to be its own thing and kind of like off to the side or what have you. And now it's actually just on X.
Yeah, I
And
feel like they
Tik-
just are
go ahead.
like, it's just X extended.
Yes. So where do all, I mean, the mainstream media used to all be on Twitter with blue checks, right? Where are they hanging out now? Are they still on Twitter? Are they on other channels? Do they move to Substack? Did it split into a bunch of different factions? How should we think about that?
I think it depends on what they're covering. The tech reporters are certainly all still on X. Political reporters are more on X than ever. I think pop culture, other people that cover other beats are not as much. Just again, because the discussion happening. One of my friends I was talking is a music reporter. She spends all her time on TikTok. TikTok has this, very insane sort of relationship with music and with audio and with artists and pop culture. So I think TikTok. I have been sort of following the change, obviously, with TikTok US and seeing if there's a change in that. I don't think there has been. I think YouTube is really trying to compete. And Instagram Reels, ironically. I do think Instagram Reels, like, it was considered boomer and lame and like this bad version of TikTok, but now there's a lot more happening on Instagram Reels. So they've done a
Reels
good
is
job.
very original. Reels is the platform that I and most of my friends around my age use the most, maybe aside
Yeah.
from Twitter and TikTok.
It's crazy.
How old are you, Tio?
21.
Okay.
I hear that all the time from people that are like
What-
20 and under.
Why is that? What is distinct there?
I think Instagram has sort of been like the backbone of my socialization with my friends for a really long time because, we have DMs and Instagram DMs are like the main channel of communication. And then they added Reels, and it is so easy. It is so integrated into the rest of the app. You just send a Reel to your friends, and then that's a DM. That's like a topic of conversation. It really like locks you in there. And
I think-
Reels are like funny and original.
I
The
think
algorithm is
TikTok,
really good.
yeah, not to interrupt. I think TikTok fucked up on not leaning harder into messaging.
Mhm.
Like, because Snapchat tried to be that. It's just that Evan Spiegel is kind of like too scared of like user generated content. Like, there's so many reasons but Snapchat is primarily, right, like a messaging app for young people. And they have content, and that's what Discover is for and stuff, but it's not quite, it doesn't have that sort of open network of effect, and Spotlight never really took off. And so I think like Reels does have that mix of a personal sort of social network of people that you're talking to and communication, but also content.
I did use Snapchat in like middle school in 2015 through 2018-ish.
Those were peak
and then
days.
yeah. And then my all of my use cases for Snapchat were totally consumed by Instagram because Instagram added stories, they added DMs, and they added Reels, which Snapchat kind of didn't. Snapchat had this thing called Spotlight, which was just terrible.
Yeah.
And
Because
so
they don't
everyone
want the
switched to
open
Instagram.
internet. Evan is too scared to like make a social platform, like a real social platform, honestly. no hate, Evan, but I think he thinks of safety first. But it's like, it's so funny because like he is probably like somewhat responsible, although Discover is so full of slop, but like, it's not this like open network in the same way that like pretty much all other social network, sort of social platforms are, but it hasn't saved him. Like he's still getting hauled up, pulled into the social media addiction lawsuit. It's still like people still villainize Snap along with all these other companies. I don't know why he doesn't just like go for it and meaningfully compete. I don't know. He's building his classes or whatever.
Like the culture of Instagram is much more positive than the culture of TikTok, which is in turn probably more positive than the culture of X. Like X, I think of as player versus player, right? Like X, like this, like people just fight on X, It is just chair throwing, brawl, political combat. Very different than even it was in the early 2010s when you could still, it was easier to just talk about, for example, you do see fundraising rounds announced, but there was a certain style of it where people would be like happy about it in the early 2010s. That's less the case. People will yell much more frequently about things that they'll be just much less happy for somebody else's success because people are, resources are scarce and everybody's mad. But Instagram in general is a fairly positive environment of people who are going outside and healthy and what have you. Substack Notes has done quite well as I think a higher IQ environment. It's because everybody there's a writer. But I do think that we want to have, one issue that's happening now is there's actually a degree of mild resurgence of mainstream media simply because there's so much AI slop out there. And so I do think we're going to need to have human-only social networks. And I think that's going to be a huge part of the future. But that also relates to the age verification stuff. It's like human verification.
I know, I hate that. Right? But it is, I agree with you. Yeah.
And so I think with ZK, there's probably a way of squaring the circle where you can prove you're a human, prove this was not, or at least you can't prove it was not written by AI, but you can at least say, I assert it was not written by AI. And you just have something where there's just less spam and scams and slop and so on and so forth, and it's a more human network. Substack is actually more like that. Though there are a fair number of people on Substack that just write enormous reams of AI slop.
If you had just subscribed to usermag.co, my Substack newsletter, you could read a article.
Subscribe to balajis.com and I will check out user.
I just wrote an article.
I don't really write that much. Go ahead.
I just wrote it. Sorry to interrupt. I just wrote an article.
Yeah.
I used Pangram. I did a little
yes,
live coding, and
yes.
I used their API to scrape all the top posts on all the bestsellers of Substack to see how much AI generated content was.
Yes, I mean the funny thing about this is, in theory, I'll often have this argument with my friends, and they'll say, "Oh, Balaji, it's theoretically impossible." I'm like, "Okay, maybe it's theoretically impossible, but it's practically very easy to spot." It's not this, it's that, and various kinds of turns, especially for ChatGPT text. And if it's so good that you can't recognize it as AI, well, okay, fine, But if you can recognize it as AI, I put a finger on it. It's like lorem ipsum. It's like lorem AI ipsum. It shows that they didn't put work into it, and it's just like if they didn't put work into it, why should I, as the reader, put work into reading it? They just kind of gave a very low effort thing that they didn't check, and they're communicating it, and they put all the effort on the reader, and it's a shortcut for the producer, and it's a huge tax on the other side. And so I think as much as I like AI within the digital tribe, it accelerates coding, it's great for search, all this kind of stuff. Between digital tribes, it's often bad because it's just, AI agents spamming 50 different people with a resume or a sales email or something like that, and just breaks the commons. And so we're going to need to have, I think, a whole new generation of human-only social networks.
I don't know how verifiable that would be. Like, you can assume some kind of biometric method of like proving that you are a human. And so you have your account that says, I'm Theo, I'm a human. But then on my account, I can just post stuff that I generated with ChatGPT, maybe with some savvy prompts to get around Pangram. But
here's the thing. Yeah. Well, here's Web3 of trust, right? So you would have the way, so there's a whole statistical cat and mouse here, but just to give you a sense, Web of trust is A asserts that B is trustworthy, who asserts C is trustworthy, who asserts D is trustworthy, and then the trust drops off, right? You trust your friend, and maybe you trust your friend's friend, but probably not your friend's 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 friend, right? And so there's a way of modeling that mathematically, And you can have not just one proof point, not just A trust B, but also, X trust B and Y trust B and Z trust B, and they trust them for a bunch of reasons, all of which is expressed in the metadata on the edges of nodes. And then you can do a calculation and inference of what is the probability that somebody continues to be human. And then you also have not just automatic pangram style reporting, but you have manual flagging of something. It's there's certain there's a set of signals people can look at, and I think if you establish the culture as being human only, and you also take away some of the payoff for pasting just reams of AI text, I think it's possible to do. It's a little bit like Snapchat, where Snapchat is disappearing messages, and yes, of course, in theory, you can take a photograph of the thing, but in practice, it did deter people from doing it. So you can set the culture in such a way that I think you can deter it.
I think instead of like, I agree with all of that. I think that people will probably just gravitate towards formats that reward. I think this is why we're seeing such a resurgence in live streaming and interest in these sort of like communal experiences, because like live is something that is so hard to fit. It is such a like a human thing. And so I think
Absolutely.
people are just gravitating towards those formats that sort of prioritize these like human communal experiences.
So that's why we're doing Network School, for the human part of things and having people meet up in person.
Is that the thing in Singapore or something?
Yes. Yeah. If you're in Singapore, let me know.
I saw a TikTok from one of those guys that was in it.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that kind of thing, in-person communities, is going to be important because, for example, focusing is best done, in my view, with pen and paper, pencil and paper, offline. And if you like to be extremely offline, focused with your own thoughts, now you can actually do something, and then you come back and you're extremely online later. But without that offline kind of thing, you don't actually have a sense of your own head. You don't have your sense of your own direction. And so I do want to have much more of that. And I think also what's happening is we have the digital divide, but in reverse, where in the 90s, people were scared that only the wealthy would have digital everything. But actually, digital everything is super cheap. Like, you basically have the same phone as Larry Page, the same Wikipedia as Sergey Brin or whatever, right? Same Grokipedia, I should say. Grokipedia is far superior to Wikipedia, by the way. So you have the same digital experience. That's been hyper deflated. And now it's physical that's a premium product. And so the digital divide is kind of in reverse. So I agree with you, Taylor. I think you're going to see much more in the way of in-person and that kind of stuff.
Taylor, I am interested in your take on Wikipedia versus Grokipedia, because one of my favorite use cases for Grokipedia is to like look at articles for people who are like totally unfairly maligned on Wikipedia.
Got it. Yeah. I mean, I do get annoyed at Wikipedia because there's a lot of misinformation about me on Wikipedia. Yeah, let's pull it up. So I'm sympathetic.
Can you get this up on stream?
Yeah, let's look at my Grokipedia. I actually haven't looked at it before. It's quite long.
Is this true?
Look at how long this thing is. Jesus Christ. Who has time to read all this? I think
That's funny.
Like I said, Wikipedia is not perfect. There's misinformation on Wikipedia. Overwhelmingly, though, what I really like about Wikipedia, and I think is good and noble, is the effort, is a decentralized, community-driven effort to get information right and compile information. And I think it's great to have competitors to that. So I'm not against the concept of like any competitor to Wikipedia. I think it's a little silly when it's like framed as like anti-woke or whatever. I think Elon was trying to say it was, like, when it initially came. I don't think Wikipedia is
it's
like
more
woke.
than that. So yes, people have said, oh, Wikipedia is Wokepedia, but there's actually a critique from the left as well, which
God.
is, people have said that, but there's a critique from the left, which is it's also Whitepedia and Westopedia, because
it's not. It has a lot of flaws.
And to be clear, I have nothing against white people or Western people and so on, but there's a critique from the right and a critique from the left that says that the kind of people who edit Wikipedia are simply not representative of the world as a whole, right? Partly because lots of people who got online in the 2010s from India, from Asia, Africa, Latin America, they may be Anglophones, they may speak whatever language, but they didn't build the political capital at the beginning to be part of Wikipedia ArbCom and all this kind of stuff, right? And so that got all ossified in a certain way. Yeah. And even if you look at like the perennial sources list or something like that, it's extremely Anglophone, Western, and so on in its orientation. and it locks out new media sources, international media sources, and so on and so forth at a structural level.
Yeah.
And so that's why I think, that's something where the economy has shifted to Asia. The economy is shifting out of America in many ways, out of the West. And so there's an inclusion argument as well to have voices outside. And I think it is definitely time for truly open source competitors. Another aspect is, Wikipedia actually licenses a lot of its content to AI companies, but it doesn't pay its creators. Right?
Well, the contributor, but anybody can be a contributor to Wikipedia, right?
In theory, but in practice, you have to have like an editor history and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
It's like all animals are equal, but some are more equal than others as a Wikipedia editor. And the thing about that is, look, it exists, and I think it did do a lot of good in the world in the early 2000s. And in fact, at that time, the insistence on only using mainstream media sources or whatever, probably at the time, I think it was less of an issue. But now today, you have a situation where there's like something's being posted on the internet from a primary source, like Jeff Bezos tweets something, but it has to get recycled.
Right,
through,
which I think is that they need to fix that.
yes,
Like the primary source thing is ridiculous. And I actually had that when I was trying to correct misinformation on my own Wikipedia at one point, and I had to get like a person to write an article, mentioning whatever. I can't even remember what I was trying to correct.
Jimmy Wales, if you're hearing this,
I'm a huge fan of Jimmy Wales, but yeah,
he should fix this. He should allow primary sources.
Yeah.
Absolutely allow primary sources, right?
Yeah.
And especially if it's like the person's own statements, or like if Elon or Trump or somebody, whatever, as long as it's their authenticated account, it should just be directly attributable to them. It shouldn't have to go through a paywalled link or something like that.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
I'm curious, Balaji, like, just like in light of sort of like your criticism of the mainstream media, I feel like where did this come from? Like because I feel like you have this like animosity towards, and I understand I'm sympathetic, from a lot of, like, I'm a big critic of the mainstream media myself, but I'm just kind of curious, like what's the origin story of all that?
Oh, great question. Well, so, I mean, look, I was actually an academic for many years.
Mm-hmm.
I was the most offline math person you could possibly meet, right? I gave my first public talk at like age 33, right? So most of my life, I was basically just essentially completely private person and just doing math and DNA sequencing and stuff like that. And I didn't really care about the media or anything like that. I mean, whatever. It was like, I don't know, as much as people care about, I don't know, architecture or something like that. It was just like an interest area, right? So, but in the 2010s, I did, like I had gotten into tech, and we had gotten into tech, and we noticed that, especially exactly post 2013, after the second Obama term, not the first, David Rosado has actually published something showing that a bunch of words related to, for example, like white privilege and phrases like this all went vertical in the New York Times exactly in 2013. And it wasn't like 2012, it was 2013. It was after the beginning of the second Obama term. And then people in tech, if they, pointed out that there was some issue with like, drug addiction in San Francisco, they would just get hammered online, and they'd get articles written on them, and they get canceled and so on and so forth. And many people lost their companies, they lost their funds. Travis Kalanick famously got attacked. Thomas Preston Werner lost GitHub. Like many heads of funds were canceled during this period. And they were just mystified as to what's going on, because they're just trying to build rocket ships or electric cars or even just some file storage product or something like that. And suddenly they're like public enemy number one, which is this bizarre kind of thing. It was very disorienting for many people. And eventually they put it together and they realized, oh, some of our colleagues on the social media and search side have completely disrupted the news business model. And Google and Facebook went vertical and took all the ad revenue. And like, for example, Rolex is running an ad on NYT.com and, Facebook.com. And, right. And so it's like, they're like a direct commercial competitor. And it was also Craigslist going after classifieds. It wasn't just ads, it was a whole thing. So then you realize, oh, okay, well, I guess we're like Coke and they're like Pepsi. And with Coke, listen to all the things Pepsi was saying about, how bad it was. And, well, Pepsi has a blog and it's bigger than our blog, so we need to set up our own blogs, right? And ultimately, by the way, at a structural level, right, there's a deep similarity between tech and media, because we're both involved in the collection, presentation and dissemination of information, right? We collect it, right? We figure out how to format it aesthetically, copy-wise, fonts, whatever, and then we disseminate it. We post it out there, right? And that's because actually, if you look, many people in tech, like I was an academic, Paul Graham was an academic, Peter Thiel was Stanford Law, he was a jurist. Larry Page was an academic, Sergey Brin was a academic, and so on and so forth. Mike Moritz was a journalist. If you look, many of us were basically, for lack of a better term, center left academics, journalists. In Peter's case, a lawyer, and so on and so forth. And we're actually of that world, right? So it's a little bit like how Yale split off from Harvard, or like America split off from Britain. We actually come from the same root. That's actually the interesting part of it, right? So I've always believed in democracy, equality of opportunity, media, academia, research, pure science, open source. I actually do unironically believe in those things. I felt that many of those words were getting corrupted in the 2010s. Go ahead. Go.
Do you unironically believe in democracy? It's okay if you don't.
Well, were you asking me or Taylor? Go ahead.
You.
Yeah, well,
Actually,
here's why.
both
Because
of you.
yeah, I'll say why. Because the market for votes is like the market. Like, capitalism is all about consent. I consented to this transaction. I consented, that I'm buying this and they're selling that. And the same way, you want a government that you've consented to. And if there's insufficient consent for a government, there's insufficient legitimacy for that government, then it's just using pure force to try to enforce. And so I think, like, one way of putting it is, Marx was very insightful about all the ways that markets could fail and all the idiosyncrasies and so on. But then often that just means, okay, you have to figure out a clever way of getting into this market. Yes, Microsoft has such a hammerlock on it, but Google figured out a way, right? And there's people on the right who are very insightful about all the ways that elections will fail, and it's all just ringers, and people brought in. But okay, fine. Nevertheless, still figure out a way to win, right? Figure out a way to build legitimacy, to build political support, because you need that as well, right? And in fact, actually, I think a lot of people in tech have over-rotated. I mean, competency is important, but it's a necessary and not sufficient. You also need legitimacy. In a sense, you need to accumulate votes just like you need to accumulate dollars. You need both and those votes, it's not just accumulating votes. You need to have, let's call it limited government. You need to have some constraints on what an individual can do. You need to have rules that people can trust, because otherwise, if you just have a pure individual, what do you have? You have a very, very unpredictable environment that's also actually bad for business. So there's a center-right argument for the center-left, which is that you want to actually have political stability. You want to have the consent of the governed. Now, the exact mechanism of that, whether it's, I do think that gerrymandered elections and so on in America, in both blue states and red states, have suppressed democratic forces in the same way that you can rig markets and so on and so forth. And so to restore that kind of democracy, I think we're going to have, many, both blue and red states in America have become de facto one-party states where elections are held, but the party always wins, just like China. Remember how I said the blues and reds have actually copied China? So you have this emerging thing where many states are becoming one-party states. So how do you have consent of the governed? Well, the answer is they still have physical exit. They have digital exit. And so then you have 1,000 communities around the world that you can apply to and choose from, just like you'd apply to college at age 18, you apply to your country at age 18. And that's how we restore democratic choice, where you have consented to the government that governs you because you have a choice, a practical choice of 1,000 of them. And so that's why I think we need to take some of these words and concepts that actually really had a lot of positivity to them and figure out how to rethink them in an internet-based age, but keeping the substance and spirit of it. Let me pause there. More I can say.
I think that you have a lot of interesting concepts there. I mean, I certainly do believe in democracy. I don't know. Yeah. I mean, I think that a lot of that stuff is interesting to think about theoretically, like the systems that you're describing. I'm not as like sort of up with all the network state stuff, but I think I'd kind of want to like look into it more and like understand it a little bit more. I guess like I asked you the question about the media just to sort of like go back to previously what we're saying, because like I do feel like just that, not that it is interesting to hear your sort of thoughts. I am glad to hear that you're pro-democracy. I kind of clocked it where Theo asked you, because I feel like you're known as somebody that has like a different version, like sort of has put forth this different version of government. But it's interesting to sort of hear it articulated out.
Actually, I have a whole talk on techno democracy.
Okay.
And actually, you can see that we're going to release an open source implementation.
Okay.
And the idea is, like, consider, for example, how politicians violate their campaign promises, right? How would you actually solve that? Like, for example, Trump promised not to go to war in Iran, and he did, right? How would you? The issue is a politician, when they're elected, there's no power above them. That's been the issue where, it's not being binding. So the social smart contract, the idea is basically that, and this is a whole other talk, and you can go and look at that or what have you. But we've put capitalism on chain with cryptocurrency. Actually, much politics actually exists online. But the only thing that doesn't exist online is a binding vote. So you can have a mutually binding vote where anybody can vote for anybody, and they're effectively signing a social smart contract. And now you've expanded the electorate. It's basically the opposite of gerrymandering. When anybody can vote for anybody, then accumulating a bunch of people voting for you is a signal of, okay, well, these 1,000 people chose that person as a political leader. And moreover, that political leader is themselves bound by a smart contract where there's limits on what they can do. So we restore rule of law with the rule of code. Anyway, I've got a whole thing on this, and I'm going to put this out there. But
I guess like I'm not up with all the sort of the theories around politics, although it's interesting to kind of hear your thoughts. And I would be interested to sort of hear you talk to more people in DC, and sort of, I'd love to hear a debate between like you and somebody sort of in DC about that maybe like has a different view on government. But
I will say one thing, which is DC is just like economically in decline.
I know.
Yeah,
I have problems with DC. DC sucks. Like, and so I just was there last week. Trust me, we probably agree on a lot of issues with that. I guess like one thing that I'm curious, like still kind of like, it seems like you have this like animosity, or not animosity, but like resentment. Like and it's not just you. Like I mean, it seems like a lot of people in tech do feel this kind of like resentment towards especially legacy media, and particularly the New York Times. Like, Balaji, you know me from working at the New York Times. That's when you were like very mad at me, even though I was very unfairly maligned. Please go back and read my Clubhouse article and see how I actually used the word unfettered. You will see that it is not how it was described.
We did actually talk about this when both of you came on separately. Balaji, you mentioned unfettered conversation.
I don't want to.
Yeah, why don't you go back
the past? But
let's
say,
but let's just
there's a lot of
indulge me.
A lot of stuff that was thrown in both directions. Let's put it like that.
Listen, 100%. And listen, I love a Twitter fight. I'm not trying to I'm not trying to like crucify anyone for fighting on Twitter. I do that all day. But I do think that like there is this like, correct me if I'm wrong, but there is this like vibe among a lot of people in tech where I do feel like they feel like almost like hurt or upset at like legacy media. And I'm kind of curious like what that origin story is. Maybe it was the tech flash, maybe it was like whatever. Some people got canceled in the 2010s, but it feels, deep.
Well, so I mean, the thing is, I think it's different today. And the reason it's different today is basically tech and media were on the same side. I mean, like, Steve Jobs, like, remember Occupy Wall Street, like everybody, he was covered, like his passing was something where even Occupy Wall Street was lighting up their iPhones for him and so on and so forth. Tech was considered to be a wing of the Democrat Party. And, Obama's first election, tech helped, elect Obama and all that kind of stuff. You remember all that, right? So there was that was something where I think in retrospect, I think the media saw, wait a second, these tech guys are going from gadget manufacturers to suddenly becoming wealthier than legacy, the legacy establishment. Also, another aspect, there's like at least 3 big differences between, let's say, New York media and Silicon Valley. And now Silicon Valley is decentralized, it's of internet. But the 3 are, well, first obviously is, paper versus digital. Like the medium. But the second is actually obviously geographic, the 3,000 miles away. But the third is perhaps the least obvious, which is demographic, right? Silicon Valley has lots of Asians, lots of Indians, lots of people from overseas. Whereas the New York Times and US media is based in Brooklyn, and they're mostly folks who have generations in the country. And so that nationalist versus internationalist aspect is also a very important question as to who has the right to speak. And implicitly, it's like, Salzburg has the right to speak. Newhouse has the right to speak, right? They have the right to speak, and you, a recent immigrant, don't, right?
Okay, wait. Can we
And
can we
because
zoom in on that a little bit because this seems
sure,
like very different from how like the New York Times might see themselves, right?
of
They don't really
course,
see themselves as
that's right. They
heritage
don't see themselves
Americans,
that
right?
way. I know. They don't see themselves that way. But you have to look at what they do rather than what they say, right? Sulzberg himself has this giant mansion, but he attacks you for being wealthy, right? Sulzberg himself has dual class stock, but they have articles
Okay,
attacking
but
Zuckerberg
that's
for
like the
having dual class
bot,
stock.
let me tell you, no one at the New York Times, like the actual journalists writing these articles that everybody's taking issue with, like they're not, they don't, I understand that like whatever, there's that famous like Chomsky interview, I think, where he's interviewing a BBC reporter and he's like, the only
Yes,
reason you're
that's
in that
exactly.
chair,
You
like
wouldn't be in the position you're in if you didn't believe the thing you did.
I'm
Exactly that
sympathetic.
quote, right?
Yes, I'm very
Yes,
sympathetic to that. But at the
yes.
same time, at what point do we let it go? Because it
Oh yeah,
has been a
no,
long
we
time.
do let
Like
it go.
at
Absolutely do
what,
let it
like
go.
I
Totally,
think
totally.
at
I
this
didn't get
point,
there
like
yet.
yes, I just like it's like it's the content creator industry is ascendant. It's only going to become more digital. The Times is a great business, it's going to continue on, but like look at where legacy media is. You're kicking a dead rabbit on the ground. You know what I mean? Like it's
Well,
so.
so actually, so let me say something on that. So first is you just asked me how the history happened because I wasn't gonna, so I just want to give you the history since you
No, I know.
asked,
I just
right?
like
But
I do have to
but
go in like
where's the
5 minutes,
go forward? Because I was
but I
thinking about
just
the
still
future.
I just think that there's like and also like maybe let's engage with actual journalists too. Like instead of like Salzburger, sure, the people again, there's tons of idiot people that run these corporations, but the actual journalists, like I don't think have necessarily like not all. Do you know what I mean? Necessarily, some of them, yes, they're chosen to be in that position for a reason, but a lot of them are just doing their job and they're doing a good job and they're trying to engage in good faith. And I think that there's a lot of animosity kind of
So
coming.
yeah, okay. So the TLDR, just to answer your question, then let's talk
Yeah.
about the go forward. The TLDR is, I think the media guys think the tech guys started it, and the tech guys think the media guys started it. I think the media guys think the tech guys started by economically disrupting them. I think the tech guys started. I think the media guys started by socially attacking them in the 2010s. But net, where did it land up? Basically, tech realized it needs to build its own media. Hence, monitoring the situation, a new live stream, right? hence X, hence All In podcast, hence Pirate Wires, hence like a bunch of shows, Gary Tan's thing, and so on and so forth. We just have to build
You don't
our
want to
own
say
thing.
TBPN?
TBPN, that's right,
What's that?
exactly. Exactly right. And it's basically like in a video game, it's like get good. And on their side, even though I disagree with a lot of what they've done, the New York Times did actually hire a bunch of programmers and built an app, and so media was like, you know what? Rather than yelling at these tech guys, we have to build our own technology. Technology had to build its own media. All right, what's the go forward?
And the
In
New
my
York
view,
Times is a technology company now because like most of what they do, like most of the revenue comes from the games.
yeah, that's right. So now I think what happened is they actually did well economically and they gained money in, but they lost power because they lost a bunch of folks who allocate capital and a bunch of folks who build things and so and so. But they gained a bunch of political partisans. Fine, whatever. Point is that I actually don't think it's like totally over because of one thing, which is one very important thing. We actually need to have decentralized cryptographic truth that's not behind a paywall, that anybody can verify, no matter how poor they are, no matter what, like phone or whatever they have, they can verify it anywhere. And they're not just taking some corporation or government's assertion for it. Now, we actually do have that with, there's actually a book called The Truth Machine, actually by former WSA reporters Vigna and Casey, but they left the WSA, at least Casey did, which says, that's what Bitcoin is. What Bitcoin is decentralized cryptographic truth. Anybody anywhere, whether they're Japanese or Chinese, Democrat or Republican, they could be European or Latin American, whatever, they agree on the state of the Bitcoin blockchain, like who has what amount of money up to trillions of dollars, and that's been true for 10 plus years. And the same algorithms that get us to consensus on financial facts, built this $1 trillion economy, we can use that with some generalization to get to consensus on other kinds of facts, other social facts. That's a big theme for me for the next several years, is establishing consensus, provable truth. It should be free. It should be open source. It should be globally verifiable. It should not be paywalled. And it's something where I think it's actually achievable. To give you a very concrete example of what I'm talking about. So, I've got a talk on the ledger of record, but now it's actually feasible. If you go, for example, to, Claude or Grok, ChatGPT, what have you, and you ask it to describe the FTX hack that happened in late 2022 and give links. it will give some links, for example, to Etherscan, which show exactly how much of what amount was hacked. So you can click that and you can see this happened at that time. And you can check the timestamp, you can check the references. Another example of this was, when there's a thing about the Brazilian fires, a few years ago, and there's a fake photo that actually Emmanuel Macron tweeted out, and the Atlantic actually ran an article on this, basically saying they're going to invade Brazil. It's a good justification to invade Brazil because of these fires. It turned out that was a fake photo, or rather a photo which a timestamp showed that there was the guy who had taken it had died years ago, so it couldn't be a contemporary photo. And you're going to, have this whole thing on this photo. The point being, that's a concrete example. There's other examples, like a Chinese case where a timestamp showed that something was patented before, or a patent was filed after a claim had been made publicly, or Elon was able to disprove a story by showing the instrumental record, the timestamps of his car versus John Broder's article, like in 2013 or something like that. The point being that this instrumental record, these timestamps, are a history that's like the history of the machine. It's all the timestamps, it's the raw data. And now you can actually use that to build a story on top of it, which cites the raw data. It cites the raw facts, it cites the primary sources. And I think that's where we want to go over the next 5 years. And the reason I don't think actually the battle, the Kobe thing, like job done, job's not done, right? Job's not done because legacy media has a little bit of a comeback. Why? Because of AI, people are going to legacy media URLs because there's some small degree of cryptographic verification. You see the HTTPS lock symbol, it's coming at least from that author, that, okay, well, they may have faked the video, but you feel where their biases are. And so we have to respond to that, not simply by going direct, but by proving correct. So that's a major theme for the next 5 years, 10 years. So that's why I don't think job's not done. And to be clear, that's not an oppositional thing, really. That's something that you'd want. Even people at legacy media companies would want that because they also want to verify stories to be correct. And sometimes those facts will be in favor of some group or against some group, but let the truth, come out and let the heavens fall. Let me pause there.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are all like, this is you have a lot of theories, and I think it'll be interesting to see kind of like the way that information ecosystems evolve and how that works out. I'm all for the sort of decentralization of information and people learning, and I think it's exciting to kind of see the way that people are even using AI to gather their own information, do their own reporting, do their own kind of investigations and stuff. I just think that also like most reporters are trying to kind of communicate, like most people, they just kind of want a story, right? They just want the gist of something. Like they're just trying to like learn about something maybe during the day. And I do think that like reporters do a good job of packaging information and delivering it to consumers in a easily digestible, largely accurate way. Of course, there's always people that are bad actors. Of course, there's always sort of wrong information. But yeah, it is interesting to think about how it evolved. I don't know if you saw that group that was accused of setting up this like fake AI generated news website. And then they had agents, actually. It was like an agent that was emailing people for comment.
It was Leading the Future PAC, right?
Yeah. So although they say that it was a vendor, they say that it was not them. But it was just interesting to see. I don't know, what interested me is that this agent had gone and emailed all these people for comment, and people were saying like, oh, I got an email from that agent or whatever. And I was like, that's interesting, like to think about. I wonder if we could get agents to FOIA document requests, email. Sometimes you have to reach out to comment for, to like 100 people if you're sourcing stuff or whatever, so I just think that it's, yeah, it'll be interesting to kind of see how it all evolves.
Yeah. One thing also I should say is I always try to figure out a win-win relationship with some industry that's being disrupted. I actually do have sympathy, because in the 2000s, it was a pretty good gig to be, a Time writer or something like that. You would have an expense account. You'd write 6 articles a year. You'd fly around the world. It's pretty chill before the financial crisis. And I get why a lot of people in Brooklyn, for example, have like a sense of loss and so on around that. Maybe that sounds funny. Maybe you have some thought.
No,
like,
I think you're totally right. I think people in LA also have a loss. I mean, I live in LA,
yes.
But like people, I mean, I have friends that are screenwriters, right? They missed the golden age of screenwriting. That's never coming back. So, yeah, I'm sure it would have been amazing to be a Vanity Fair writer in 1995, but it doesn't exist anymore. And it is what it is,
That's
now
right.
You can be a live streamer.
Good.
Now we can all be live streamers.
Well, I'm kind of
MTS.
serious about that. Like, I think that sort of content creation has surpassed and supplanted that. And you can, have a pretty great lifestyle as an online content creator. Just because the institutions don't make it so easy to get that anymore.
I
Doesn't
just
mean
think,
Well,
yeah, totally.
one thing you mentioned, I have millions and I should do something. And so one thing I actually do want to do is fund, and I have been doing this quietly actually for a while, but I'm going to do more of it more publicly, is funding media, academia, democracy, equality, that kind of stuff. Where, like basically with crypto in particular, I can put up a prize or a task, and anybody from anywhere can do that, and we can pay them pseudonymously or publicly or whatever, and we can have, like it'll be different than, let's say, the blockbuster picture of the 20th century, just like that was different from Broadway and plays, but in some ways it has more upside because somebody who's like now you can be the full stack yourself, right? So taking Hollywood, you can be the screenwriter, you can be the director, you can cast the actors, you can translate into 50 different languages. The true auteur can actually now do it without requiring a deal with Paramount or something like that. So I think there's a role. Basically, I'm sympathetic to especially like people who've lost jobs and so on. But I think just like Substack kind of stepped in and it was able to build a new model
But
for writers. I think we can do
it
that for
doesn't
creators.
support reporting is the problem, right? Is that that economy, this content creator economy doesn't support like in-depth investigative reporting. And I think that's what we're losing out.
So on that topic, right, I will say something, which is, so, there's a saying, which is, he doxes, she leaks, but the New York Times investigates, right? And basically the issue is that for somebody who's not elected to just go and spy on somebody else and dig through their garbage and so on and so forth. Like there's a journalist,
we want that,
unnamed, who went to like Benioff's mansion and was literally digging through his garbage in Hawaii, or something like that, right?
Are you talking about Pui Wing, the most iconic?
Okay, fine.
The
fine,
most iconic journalist. I don't know. Was it Ellison or Benioff? I don't remember, but
I think it was Benioff. But
okay.
The point is that basically, if that was not a quote journalist, that would be seen as stalking, harassment, cyber stalking. Like it'd be weird, right? For person A to develop to go and go through person, because
but that's very silly. You could, but the context of that behavior matters, right? The context of
the context
calling someone up and asking their associates questions would be weird, but in the context of a job, checking job references, it's normal, right? Like the
but
context
consent
matters.
Right? So the thing is, if I just see
consent,
that person,
if you call up and say, should I hire this? I'm like, I'm looking into hiring this person.
But think about it. If that's somebody who is just, in my view, Sulzberger's employee, Bezos's employee, Murdoch's employee, whose ultimate bottom line is the number of page views that they're making for this inherited media corporation.
Well, they don't care about page views anymore. They care about subscriptions. They haven't cared about page views.
Okay, fine. But subscriptions, conversions. Point being, like, ultimately, it's not like they're some elected official, right? It's not like I consented. Look, if the FBI,
but hold on a second. But you don't want. But we. Okay, so there's value, right? In I talk to a lot of investors or people, people in finance, right? There's value in the reporting that someone like Pui Wing was doing for the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, right? Like they are uncovering things about companies that is valuable to people, to the public, to either public knowledge or investors or, shareholders, et cetera. So I think there's value in uncovering a lot of this information.
Well, but think about what you're saying. There's value to News Corp, right?
Sure, but there's also value to the public.
I think that's where I think we may disagree, because I would say News Corp is a media corporation that makes money from attacking other corporations, getting their private information, reselling it for money, but then they pay all their own stuff. News Corp doesn't want reporting on News Corp.
But wait,
right?
sorry, but Balaji, you just said you want information to be totally free. So you certainly do recognize that there is value to uncovering non-public information. You think that, wait, sorry, hold on. I just want to understand.
Sure.
So do you think that when you say consent, you mean that you think that information, if somebody hasn't consented to share information, it shouldn't be public?
I think just like you should not be subject non-consensually to government surveillance, you shouldn't be subject non-consensually to corporate surveillance.
Well, but we're not talking about, but what about an independent media reporter? Is that okay?
Well, what if it's like a stalker who's got a
No.
Substack and wants to sell subscriptions to their Substack? by
Okay, so
stalking
that's
you?
what you're right. So okay, so anybody doing journalism, what if it's a nonprofit newsroom? What
Well,
if
actually,
it's a
I want to
nonprofit newsroom doing
let's take the word
journalism?
journalism for a second, okay?
Okay.
So if for example, and just hear me out for a second. So
Okay, I'm very confused
if
by
somebody
this.
in China is doing like some robotics thing, right?
Okay.
Zuck would never say they're not doing technology. Technology is assumed to be a human universal, right? But for many years, and maybe still today, if you ask somebody who works in, like like legacy media, and you said, is Glenn Greenwald doing journalism? Is Tucker Carlson doing journalism? Is CGTN or like a Chinese media, are they doing
Yeah,
journalism?
yeah.
They'd say no. They'd say they're not. That's not real journalism, even if they might have much larger.
Everybody has a different opinions on what's quote unquote real journalism, and a lot
No,
of
I know,
it's
I know.
driven by ideology. But you can understand that there's value in uncovering non-public information, right? There's value to the public in uncovering non-public information, right?
But the public, well, so two things. I disagree with that because the
But
public
didn't you say you
is.
want this like open, decentralized information ecosystem? Do you
Yeah,
think
but there's a
things like
difference. There's a big difference. It's
Polymarket
all
are bad
consent.
also?
Consent. Yeah. So let me say something. The public, what is the public? The public is 8 billion people, right? That's like everybody.
Okay.
So the person who's at the company that's being attacked by News Corp, like the News Corp employee is making money at the expense of the tech company that they're spying on. And that doesn't necessarily benefit 8 billion people. It might entertain them. The News Corp employee would be extremely perturbed if someone was spying on them. They'd lose their minds. They'd get super mad about that, right? So nobody.
No, but people report on me all the time. I'm a public figure. People report on me all the time.
There's a difference between your public statements and then going and surveilling you, spying on you. Like no one, like.
But if it's relevant to the public, right? Like people aren't just randomly like spying on someone for no reason. They're trying to get information that is inherently valuable to the public.
Okay, wait. When you say, what do you mean by the public? Do you mean the Kazakhstanis? Do you mean the entire world? No, like actually,
a portion of the
Edward
public,
Burns,
I guess. I guess a portion of the public.
Yes, a portion of the public.
Okay.
That's right. So it is those people who are paying News Corp.
I don't think it's always. I don't think it's always the people that ultimately are paying. But
why? Because it's paywalled. It's paywalled content, right?
Some of it's
so the only people who are seeing.
Yeah.
Hear me out for a second, right? News Corp goes and steals or surveils, some company.
What about a nonprofit newsroom that is not paywalled, like something like ProPublica?
Okay, so, but at least you're with me so far. Let's go to the nonprofit in a second. But it's not the public. It's a News Corp subscriber who can actually see the article that News Corp got stolen information or they surveilled somebody to publish it. So Murdoch makes money. The Wall Street Journal reporter makes, page views or has subscriptions, whatever. And the subscriber to News Corp who is paying Murdoch, yes, yeah, maybe they get some entertainment value out of it or whatever.
They get sometimes they'll get actual business. Sometimes they'll get especially if you're a Wall Street Journal and New York Times subscriber, you're often subscribing because you want information. You want information that is going to help you run your business.
Sometimes. But here's the thing: a lot of that stuff is actually very
entertainment. Sure.
A lot of that stuff is very it's entertainment. A lot of it's actually very negative. For example, like look, a true public good is like a bridge, a piece of infrastructure, and so on and so forth, like electrification. Yeah, that I do believe in the public good.
And what if that bridge was what if the guy who made the bridge secretly paid someone off to, not file any of the safety reports and it's actually a huge threat?
Let me give you an example.
Somebody wants to investigate whether the bridge is a threat because actually once the car drives over it, somebody could die.
Of course, but let me give you a different example. So, when Obama was running against, like in his first Senate election, there was a candidate and his wife, and I think Jerry Ryan and Jack Ryan, and there was like some like sealed divorce papers or something like that they had both between themselves. That was just their own, they had agreed that was just sealed or whatever. And then some outlet went and got that and printed it. Why? Because they wanted to elect Obama. I mean, that's a real answer. And it harmed that couple and that family.
Yeah, I don't know the context of that, but I'm not going to argue that people haven't crossed the line or published the teal thing. Obviously, I agree with that.
Well, Taylor, what would you say the line is?
Sorry, what?
What would you say the line is where journalist investigative reporting becomes like surveillance?
Oh, well, it's all surveillance. Look, Matt, if you guys are worried about surveillance, like we have a bit, like I am very against mass surveillance. So, like, trust me, you have a lot of sympathies. I'm actually very.
Where it becomes stalking, let's say.
Well, right, but I don't think it's stalking for somebody to be reporting critically on a company. And I think sometimes But I agree with you that just let me finish, Balaji.
Yeah,
I
sure, go
hear
ahead.
you.
Sure.
I understand. Trust me. You are heard. I'm sympathetic. I have right-wing media reporters calling up my family members, harassing my family members, showing up places. I'm so sympathetic to this argument. I think there should be a very high bar. I famously wrote about libs of TikTok. I've talked extensively about the many bars that met, primarily that she was directly shaping laws in Florida. And I think that we have a right to know if an anonymous Twitter account is directly informing legislation that is going to be used to regulate us. We should know who's informing that, because for all we know, it could be somebody abroad. It could be somebody, we should know kind of who's behind that. So I'm not saying that I do believe in the value of uncovering non-public information. That said, I know there's bad actors out there. I think there's bad actors out there in the content creator ecosystem as well. I don't think it's just a corporate media problem. I think that there's a lot of kind of crowdsourced investigations. I write about this a lot that are happening now on YouTube and Instagram and TikTok that go far more than you're talking about. Journalists, I think, at least have to abide by some sort of ethical standards. Balaji, I don't know when the last time you've been on some of these TikTok T accounts, but they don't have those boundaries, right?
So here's the thing. I think the line, I'm glad to hear you say, and by the way, it's too bad, about your family and so on and so forth. I support privacy. And in general, if you haven't made something public, then okay, like there's a democratic process, there's rule of law, there's the concept of search warrants.
Do you think it's
right?
But do you think it's valuable to know, for instance, that OpenAI hasn't hit revenue targets or is struggling to reach 1 billion users?
Okay, but let me. What I think is valuable is privacy as a bedrock kind of thing. So let me explain what I mean.
But don't you think it's valuable to know that? Don't you think it's valuable for, you don't think that information has value? It certainly does.
The reason I'm very skeptical about that kind of thing is I have seen so many incorrect reports of that kind of thing. Like, for example, go back and look in the early, I'll give you a concrete example. Google's toughest search is for a business model. I think this is in 2003, NYT article. And it basically said, 2002, 2003, it said Google isn't making money. And that wasn't information. It was actually just wrong. Because
totally. There's wrong information that comes out. I'm not arguing that. But if the information is correct, would you say that that's valuable?
Not necessarily, because it's like, look,
crazy.
I mean, it's like taking, okay, here, if you had a
we have to have a debate
photo,
2.0.
Hear me out, Taylor. If you had a surveillance photo of somebody and they were, I don't know, they were in their towel or something like that, and you published it and lots of people clicked on it. Yeah, it's a real photo. It's true. But there would have to be news value to. It would have to be relevant for a reason. Who's judging that?
Yeah, and I think it's totally good to question who's making these judgments, who decides what's new, what's valuable, who decides what the news value of certain information is.
And that's why it goes back to the publishers, right? So essentially, look, my view is with the rise of the internet, there's going to be a lot more people from outside the US, outside the West, outside basically to both the right and the left of the current ecosystem who are going to have a voice and are not simply going to be downstream and accept that Sulzberger and Newhouse and Murdoch and these kind of guys are the ones who ultimately judge what is newsworthy. I don't think that's acceptable. They're not elected. They can't be fired.
Sure, totally.
Right? There's no accountability.
I totally agree with you on that. But I also think that we should strive to, there is value in non-public information. And I think that we see this coming out more and more with citizen journalism, right? Which I think you support. So
I do support citizen journalism, but I want to be very clear about what I support when I say that. I don't mean surveillance. I don't mean stalking. I mean hey, here's a pothole on the street that hasn't been repaired. I'm going to write it up.
And what if it's corporate wrongdoing? And what if it's corporate wrongdoing?
So if it's corporate wrongdoing, well, there's a police report that you file, right?
But what if it's not necessarily a police report, but what if it's this is what I'm talking about of I do think that there are people, for instance, I write a lot of stories where people within a company or within a program, they want their story out. They know that there is huge consequences for them actually speaking publicly, going out and trying to do that. There would be retaliation. So they go to a journalist, right? And they say, hey, can you help me get this information out? And I do think that there's value to that, especially with the government too, by the government.
So I generally think that is not really pure-hearted. I think often people will do that because they can't get their way internally at the company.
Yeah, everybody has motivation.
Everybody has motivation.
Hear you. Yeah,
that's right. And also often, let's say you've got 500 people at a company and one of them goes and defects and gives some non-private information. or non-public information. The other 499, their equity value goes down. They're basically like traders that betrayed the tribe.
Not the equity value. I know. I just think,
No, I'm
but
just saying,
sometimes
like,
that information is valuable. I hear you.
that
I
means
think
that-
there's a lot more nuance to this than we can probably agree on.
Well, okay, I'll put it like this. We may not agree on this, but at least you wanted to hear my, maybe I can, my point of view is just that. A, privacy is very important. B, we should consent to having things put in public. And C, there is actually a process for non-consensual, privacy, but that's a search warrant, right? Like a privacy invasion, whatever you want to call it. Like there is a mechanism where if somebody's trying to keep something private, but it actually should be more public, it's called a search warrant. There's
I don't think we should have
right?
a search. I especially with the government, Balaji, at least we can agree. We should criticize. Like, I guess I have a different view. I'm all for privacy. I'm all for privacy. But when I see what these lawmakers are doing, for instance, don't you think it's valuable to know like who's behind groups like the Digital Childhood Alliance that's advocating for all these identity verification laws across the United States? These groups going around, we're child safety, we're just a bunch of grassroots moms. No, you're not. You're funded by evil, groups, or you're funded by Meta. You're funded by. I think there's value in knowing that.
I think
this is public record, right?
No.
Well, but here's the thing.
It's not.
The way that actually manifests is it's just some like titillation, revelation, get people mad, get a lot of views.
No, it can directly affect policies. It can directly affect whether people listen to those groups and whether they find those groups credible. If that somebody's just a front group.
That means policy is just set by leak after leak after leak after leak after leak.
Ideally not, but certainly I think there is value to these leaks, and I think there's value to some of this information. And I do think that we should strive to uncover valuable information.
Yeah, and I guess my alternative
and it's not
view
what
is,
like Polymarket is and all this. Isn't that sort of also the goal of all of that stuff is to sort of uncover information collectively?
I actually was an angel investor in Polymarket, but I did it because I actually don't really believe in prediction markets. I believe in verification markets. That is to say, like, to actually resolve whether a bet happened, you actually have to have the historical record of what happened. And, for example, the kind of things I'm interested in prediction markets would be like an internal prediction market within a company for when is this feature going to ship, or, is this bug going to be fixed, and so on and so forth. And there's things like that you can do, which are, I think, positive applications. But
we got to have a 2.0 because I do have to bounce. But we have to have a 2.
I very much don't agree with the disclosure of non-public information for prediction markets or anything else like that.
I hear you.
Even if somebody, but actually that's a good example. That might be some private individual who discloses non-public information in order to make money. I think it's almost exactly the same as a journalist who does it in order to get subscribers.
The journalist is not profiting directly in the same way, but I hear you. I do.
Anyway,
we might disagree on this, but I appreciate your commitment to privacy, and I appreciate that you, are against these age verification, identity verification laws, and I think we can at least agree on that. But I do have to go. I'm so sorry. I'm so late on my story.
Great. This is great.
This has been great. Yeah, thank you both so much for coming on the show. It was heartwarming, really, to see how much you agree on some pretty fundamental things. I wonder how many more segments we can do like this.
Well, this might be a one-off, but this is fun. All right, I will see you later, Theo.
Okay, bye guys. Bye. It was great to chat.
Thank you both.
Okay, all right, bye-bye.